Meet Armand Blecher, the scariest Hell's Angel most people never heard of. Standing 6 feet 8 inches and weighing a massive 350 pounds, this human mountain didn't need guns or weapons to terrify his enemies. Even baseball bats bounced off him like toys. His massive fists could crush bones, and legendary biker Sonny Barger once said he'd rather have Armand by his side than 10 other angels combined. Discover how this towering enforcer became a terrifying legend before meeting his shocking end. Man Mountain. When Armand Blecher walked into a room, everything seemed to shrink around him. At 6 feet 8 inches tall and weighing a massive 350 pounds, he wasn't just big. He was a human mountain. People who met him never forgot the experience. His shoulders were so wide he had to turn sideways to get through some doorways. His hands were like baseball mitts, capable of completely wrapping around a man's arm with fingers to spare. But Armand wasn't born this way. As a kid growing up in California in the 1950s, he was actually picked on by bullies. Hard to believe when you picture what he became. The story goes that young Armand got fed up with being pushed around and decided to transform himself. He hit the gym with an obsession that bordered on madness. Day after day, he pumped iron until his muscles screamed. While other guys might work out to look good at the beach, Armand trained like his life depended on it. And according to biker legends, he didn't stop at just working out. Whispers followed him that he used horse steroids to pack on even more size, though nobody ever dared ask him about it to his face. By the time he patched in with the Hells Angels in the late 1960s, he was already becoming a legend. Other bikers would point him out at rallies, and newbies couldn't believe their eyes. "That can't be real," they'd say. But he was real all right, and the sight of him climbing off his chopper, which looked like a kid's toy beneath him, was enough to make even the toughest guys nervous. Sonny Barger, the famous leader of the Hells Angels, once said that if he had to go into battle, he'd rather have just Armand by his side than 10 other angels. That wasn't just talk. Armand's size was so intimidating that many fights never even started. One look at the giant angel cracking his knuckles was usually enough to make potential troublemakers suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. No guns needed. While most outlaw bikers packed heat, Armand Blecher was known for something unusual in the violent biker world of the 1970s. He rarely carried weapons. With fists the size of Christmas hams, why would he need to? "Guns are for guys who can't handle their business," he reportedly once said to a prospect who was showing off a new pistol. The young biker quickly tucked the gun away, lesson learned. When trouble broke out at bars where Armand worked as a bouncer, he didn't reach for a weapon, he simply waded in. One famous story tells how 3 drunk truckers started causing problems, throwing bottles and threatening the bartender. Armand simply picked up the first guy one-handed by his collar, carried him to the door like a misbehaving puppy, and tossed him into the parking lot. The other 2 troublemakers took one look and followed their buddy out without a word. What made Armand truly terrifying wasn't just his size, it was his seeming immunity to pain. A rival gang member once claimed he hit Armand multiple times with a baseball bat during a bar brawl, only to watch in horror as the giant barely flinched before grabbing him by the throat. "It was like hitting a redwood tree," the man supposedly said later. As a bouncer and bodyguard, Armand's reputation grew beyond the biker world. Hollywood stars and musicians wanted the imposing figure by their side. Frank Sinatra reportedly hired him as personal protection during a West Coast tour, and the two became unlikely friends. The contrast between the 5'7" crooner and his mountain-sized bodyguard made quite the impression at exclusive clubs and restaurants. Armand's no-guns policy wasn't about being peaceful. He was still involved in plenty of violence, according to police records. But there was something almost old-school about his approach. In a world where anyone could pull a trigger, Armand believed in the power of his fists. And for many years, they were all he needed to stay on top of the dangerous world he called home. Bulletproof beast. If you asked anyone who ran into Armand Blecher back in the 70s, they'd tell you he wasn't a normal human being. Sure, his massive 6 feet 8 inches frame and 350 pounds of muscle were impressive enough, but there was something else about him. Something that made people whisper that he might actually be bulletproof. Of course, he wasn't really bulletproof. The 3 bullets that ended his life at age 33 proved that. But for years, the stories about his ability to shrug off punishment that would drop any normal man made him seem almost superhuman. Take the infamous Oakland bar fight of 1972. According to biker lore, Armand was enjoying a quiet beer when 4 members of a rival club decided to jump him. Bad idea. One guy smashed a beer bottle over Armand's head. The bottle shattered, beer went everywhere, and Armand just turned around slowly, wiped the beer from his eyes, and smiled. That smile, witnesses said, was scarier than any threat. Within minutes, all four attackers were laid out on the floor, and Arman went back to his beer like nothing had happened. When the police showed up, they found Arman with barely a scratch while his opponents needed ambulances. Then there was the legendary baseball bat incident. This one got told and retold so many times around biker campfires that it's hard to separate fact from fiction. But the basic story goes like this. During a territory dispute with another gang, someone took a Louisville slugger to Arman's back. The wooden bat literally splintered on impact. Arman turned around, grabbed the guy by his jacket, and sent him flying across the room with one punch. The attacker had been a college baseball player. He hit Arman with everything he had. Might as well have been swinging a toothpick at a grizzly bear. How did Arman do it? Some said it was the steroids he allegedly used. Others pointed to his unnatural pain tolerance. A few even claimed he practiced some kind of Eastern meditation that allowed him to block out pain. The truth was probably more straightforward, a combination of adrenaline, alcohol, and an absolutely massive frame that could absorb punishment that would flatten smaller men. Arman's reputation for being bulletproof spread far beyond biker circles. Bouncers at clubs throughout California told stories about him. One night at a San Francisco nightclub, a drunk with a knife thought he could take on the giant doorman. According to witnesses, Arman let the guy cut him on the arm, a long, shallow slice, just to prove a point. While blood dripped down his massive forearm, Arman never broke eye contact with the knife wielder. He then calmly reached out, took the knife away, and bent the blade in half before tossing it aside. This seemingly supernatural resistance to pain earned Arman the nickname The Beast among those who feared him most. Police reports from his numerous arrests often noted his unusual calmness, even when injured or in handcuffs. One Fresno officer wrote in a report that the suspect had visible injuries but showed no signs of discomfort or distress. He refused medical attention, stating he didn't believe in doctors. His fellow Hell's Angels used his reputation to their advantage. When collecting debts or intimidating rivals, they'd bring Arman along and share stories of his indestructibility. By the mid-70s, just the rumor that Arman might show up was enough to make people pay up or back down. A former club member who knew Arman shared a telling story years later. They were at a roadhouse out near Bakersfield, and some local tough guys decided to start trouble. One of them had brass knuckles and caught Arman right in the jaw. Now, brass knuckles will drop most anybody, right? But Arman just stood there, worked his jaw back and forth a couple times, and said it tickled. The troublemakers cleared out of the bar faster than anyone had ever seen. What made Arman even more intimidating was that he seemed to enjoy pain, or at least he never showed any fear of it. While other bikers would brag about their wounds and scars, Arman acted like his were nothing special. A broken finger? He'd just tape it up himself and keep going. A knife wound? Just another day at the office. This attitude extended to his famous bar fights. While most brawlers try to avoid getting hit, Arman sometimes intentionally took a punch or two just to show his opponents how little effect they had. It was psychological warfare at its most primitive, and it worked. A bartender from a Fresno dive bar recalled seeing Arman let a guy punch him square in the stomach once. This was a big dude too, a former boxer. He hit Arman with everything he had. Arman just laughed and asked if that was all he got. The guy practically ran out of the bar. Stories about Arman's toughness weren't limited to fights. Fellow bikers swore he could drink amounts of alcohol that would put normal men in the hospital. One tale claims he drank an entire bottle of whiskey in one go during an initiation ritual, then rode his motorcycle 100 miles without showing any signs of being drunk. His pain resistance wasn't just for show, it had practical benefits in the biker world. In a culture where showing weakness could be deadly, Arman's ability to shrug off injuries gave him a massive advantage. Other bikers knew that hurting him wouldn't slow him down, it would just make him mad. Arman's reputation was so strong that some Hell's Angels chapters would borrow him from his Fresno base when they needed extra muscle for particularly dangerous situations. He became something of a troubleshooter for the club, showing up when tensions were highest and the risk of violence was greatest. His appearance alone was often enough to prevent bloodshed. Rival gangs would take one look at the giant angel and decide that whatever the dispute was about, it wasn't worth facing him. This earned Arman a strange respect even among enemies of the Hell's Angels, who viewed him as something like a force of nature, not evil, just unstoppable. Law enforcement agencies had their own files on Arman, with one police detective describing him as impervious to standard compliance techniques. This was cop speak for saying that pepper spray, batons, and even tasers seemed to have minimal effect on him. It typically took multiple officers to restrain him during his numerous arrests. But perhaps the most impressive testament to Arman's toughness wasn't from a fight at all. During a motorcycle accident in 1974, he was thrown from his bike at high speed, breaking several ribs and fracturing his arm. Witnesses expected to find a dead or at least unconscious man. Instead, they found Arman trying to lift his 700-pound chopper by himself, concerned more about damage to his bike than his own injuries. When paramedics arrived, he refused treatment and somehow managed to ride his damaged motorcycle home, one-handed with broken ribs. He didn't visit a hospital. Instead, a club member who had some medical training wrapped his ribs, set his arm in a homemade cast, and Arman was back at the clubhouse bar that same night. Of course, no human is truly bulletproof, and Arman's seeming invincibility likely drove him to take risks that eventually caught up with him. His belief in his own indestructibility might explain why he reportedly walked into that fateful confrontation with his cousins unarmed, never expecting that the day would end with him bleeding out on the floor of their tire shop. The legend of the bulletproof beast lives on in biker folklore, growing with each retelling. Some stories claim he once caught a bullet with his teeth, or that knives would bend on contact with his skin. Pure fiction, of course, but the truth, a mountain of a man with an unnatural tolerance for pain and a complete disregard for his own safety, was frightening enough without embellishment. In the end, Arman Blecher wasn't bulletproof at all. He was just a man, albeit an extraordinarily large and tough one, who created such an intimidating presence that the stories about him took on a life of their own. But for a few brief years in the 1970s, if you were in a California bar and saw this giant walk through the door, you might have believed the legends yourself. Star Protector. In the glitzy world of 1970s, Hollywood and Las Vegas, celebrities needed protection. Not just from overeager fans wanting autographs, but from real dangers, stalkers, kidnapping threats, and organized crime. While most stars hired ex-cops or military men in neat suits, Frank Sinatra made a different choice. For a period in the early 1970s, the legendary singer reportedly had the most intimidating bodyguard in the business, Arman Blecher, the 6'8", 350-pound Hells Angels enforcer known as the Beast. The unlikely partnership between the refined entertainment icon and the massive outlaw biker began, according to insider stories, after an incident at a Las Vegas casino. Sinatra, no stranger to mob connections himself, had supposedly been having trouble with some unwanted characters making threats. His usual security detail wasn't cutting it. That's when someone suggested bringing in the biggest, scariest man in California, Arman Blecher. The visual contrast alone made people stop and stare. Sinatra, the elegant crooner standing barely 5 feet 7 inches in his custom Italian shoes, walking alongside a mountain of a man whose shoulders were wider than most doorways. Photographers loved catching glimpses of the odd pair, though they learned quickly to keep their distance. Arman didn't appreciate flashbulbs going off in his face, and cameras had a tendency to accidentally break when pointed in his direction. For Sinatra, having Blecher around solved problems before they started. The singer had a famous temper and occasionally got into situations that required muscle to resolve. With Arman looming behind him, those situations simply evaporated. Nobody wanted to test whether the rumors about the Hells Angels' strength and pain tolerance were true. Hotel staff from Vegas to Palm Springs remembered the giant biker standing silently in corners during Sinatra's performances, scanning the crowd with cold eyes. Waiters recalled having to look up, way up, to take his drink orders, always non-alcoholic when he was working. Arman might have been a heavy drinker in his off hours, but on protection duty, he stayed completely sober and alert. The arrangement worked well for both men. Sinatra got the ultimate deterrent against trouble, and Arman got a legitimate paycheck plus access to a world most outlaw bikers never saw. The Hells Angel moved easily between two worlds, the glittering high life of celebrities and the gritty reality of outlaw motorcycle clubs. This dual existence added to his mystique. Arman's protection duties went beyond just standing around looking intimidating. He would scout locations before Sinatra arrived, checking for security weaknesses and potential problems. He would position himself strategically during public appearances, always keeping his eyes moving. And he developed a sixth sense for spotting trouble in a crowd, a skill honed during years of bar fights and biker brawls. His methods weren't always gentle. One story from a Las Vegas hotel worker described seeing Arman deal with a persistent autograph seeker who wouldn't take no for an answer. The massive biker didn't punch the man or create a scene. Instead, he simply placed one enormous hand on the fan's shoulder and steered him firmly toward the exit. The grip was tight enough to make the message clear without leaving bruises. The man left quickly, looking pale. Beyond Sinatra, rumors swirled about other celebrities who hired Arman for protection. Various Hollywood stars, rock musicians, and even a famous boxer supposedly used his services when they needed extra security. Each industry had its own stories about the giant biker who could clear a path through any crowd just by walking forward. For celebrities with edgier reputations, having a Hell's Angel as protection added to their outlaw image. Rock stars particularly appreciated how Armand's presence kept record executives and unwanted groupies at a safe distance. His intimidation factor worked on everyone from teenage fans to suited businessmen. What made Armand different from other bodyguards wasn't just his size, it was his background. Most security professionals came from law enforcement or military backgrounds. They knew rules and procedures. Armand came from a world where violence wasn't just a possibility, but an everyday reality. His approach to protection came from experience, not training manuals. This difference showed in how he handled potential threats. Professional bodyguards were taught to evacuate their clients from dangerous situations. Armand's instinct was to eliminate the threat entirely. Several times, according to Vegas insiders, Sinatra had to specifically order him not to hurt someone who had crossed a line. The singer reportedly appreciated the loyalty, but didn't want excessive violence associated with his name. The entertainment industry gossip columns occasionally hinted at Armand's presence in Sinatra's entourage, usually describing him only as a large associate or personal security. The Hells Angels connection was rarely mentioned in print, partly because Armand himself avoided publicity, and partly because Sinatra's team worked to keep it quiet. Nevertheless, industry insiders knew exactly who the giant man in the corner was. His reputation spread through Hollywood whisper networks, with stories growing more outlandish with each telling. Some claimed he had once carried an unconscious Sinatra through a kitchen fire after a club explosion. Others insisted he had thrown a stalker off a second-story balcony into a swimming pool. Most of these tales were certainly exaggerated, but they added to the mystique surrounding the unlikely bodyguard. Armand's duties sometimes extended beyond just physical protection. He reportedly drove Sinatra to private meetings where the singer didn't want his regular entourage present. He delivered messages too sensitive for phones, and he stood watch outside hotel rooms during meetings that never appeared in any official schedule. The full extent of his service to Sinatra may never be known, but it clearly went beyond simple security work. The relationship wasn't just professional. According to those who knew both men, Sinatra actually liked having Armand around. The singer had always been fascinated by tough guys with colorful backgrounds, and Armand certainly qualified. They weren't friends exactly, their worlds were too different for that. But there was mutual respect. Sinatra appreciated loyalty and straightforwardness, qualities Armand had in abundance. For his part, Armand never bragged about his celebrity connections back at the Hells Angels clubhouse. When asked about rumors that he worked for Sinatra, he would typically shrug them off or change the subject. The code of the outlaw biker didn't include name-dropping about famous clients, no matter how impressive they might be. The arrangement eventually ended, though stories differ on exactly why. Some say Sinatra's regular security team felt undermined by the biker's presence. Others claim Armand's increasingly complicated legal issues made him too much of a liability for a public figure like Sinatra. Whatever the reason, the giant Hells Angel eventually returned to his primary world of motorcycle clubs and bar bouncing. But the legend of the Star Protector lived on in Hollywood. Even decades later, security professionals in the entertainment industry would reference Armand's time with Sinatra as the gold standard of intimidation. Nobody who saw the giant biker standing guard ever forgot him, or dared to cause trouble while he was watching. The unlikely partnership between one of America's most beloved entertainers and one of its most feared bikers remains a fascinating footnote in celebrity history. It shows how even stars who lived in the spotlight sometimes needed help from men who operated in the shadows. And for a brief time in the 1970s, the biggest shadow of all belonged to Armand Blecher, the Hells Angel who protected the stars. Sonny's seal of approval. When it comes to the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, one name stands above all others in terms of respect and authority: Ralph "Sonny" Barger. As the founder of the Oakland chapter and longtime national president, Barger's opinion carried more weight than almost anyone else in the outlaw biker world. When Sonny Barger spoke, Hells Angels listened, and when it came to Armand Blecher, Barger didn't just speak, he raved. According to biker law, Barger once made a statement that cemented Blecher's reputation forever. When asked who he'd want by his side in a serious situation, Barger reportedly said he'd rather have just Armand than 10 other Hells Angels combined. Coming from a man who had hundreds of tough bikers at his disposal, this was the ultimate endorsement. Barger first met Blecher in the late 1960s when the giant was still a prospect, working to earn his full patch with the Fresno chapter. Even then, before he reached his full physical prime, Bletcher stood out. Not just because of his height and build, but because of his unusual approach to conflict. While many prospects tried to prove themselves through wild, uncontrolled aggression, Bletcher was notably calm and calculated. He didn't waste energy on unnecessary movements or threats. When action was needed, he simply acted. This efficiency impressed Barger, who had seen countless tough guys come and go over the years. The Hells Angels leader had a military background, having served in the army, and he appreciated discipline even within the chaotic world of outlaw bikers. Bletcher's methodical approach to violence, combined with his extraordinary physical gifts, made him stand out from the typical muscle. By the early 1970s, when Bletcher had earned his full colors and established his fearsome reputation, Barger would occasionally borrow him from the Fresno chapter for situations that required special handling. While the details of these missions remained shrouded in biker secrecy, their results would often be evident. Problems that had been brewing suddenly disappeared, rival gangs backed down, and disputes were settled with surprising speed. In his memoir, Barger briefly mentioned Bletcher without using his full name, referring to him only as the big man from Fresno, a nod to both his physical stature and his importance within the club. Barger described watching Bletcher load 2 motorcycles into a truck by himself, lifting each bike as if it were a bicycle rather than a 700-pound machine. The story was written with clear admiration, rare for a man who was notoriously sparing with his praise. This approval from the top of the Hells Angels hierarchy gave Bletcher a special status within the club. While he never held an official leadership position, he wasn't cut out for the politics and planning that came with being an officer. He enjoyed a level of respect typically reserved for chapter presidents and longtime members. Even angels from other chapters, who might normally look down on a relatively new member, treated Bletcher with cautious respect when he was around. Barger's endorsement wasn't just about Bletcher's fighting ability. The Hells Angels president valued loyalty above almost everything else, and Bletcher had proven himself unfailingly loyal to the club. Unlike some members who put their own interests first, Bletcher always prioritized the Angels. He never talked to law enforcement, never complained about taking the dangerous assignments, and never tried to leverage his reputation for personal gain. This loyalty extended to Barger personally. On multiple occasions when tensions arose within the club, inevitable in an organization filled with strong personalities and volatile tempers, Bletcher firmly aligned himself with Barger's faction. This wasn't blind following. Bletcher simply recognized Barger's leadership as beneficial for the club as a whole. Having the biggest, most intimidating member firmly in your corner was a significant advantage for Barger in maintaining his position. The relationship between the two men wasn't exactly friendship in the traditional sense. They were too different for that. Barger was calculating, politically savvy, and media conscious, carefully crafting the Hells Angels' public image, even while engaging in activities he knew were better kept private. Bletcher was straightforward, uninterested in publicity, and focused entirely on the present moment rather than long-term strategy. But despite these differences, they shared a mutual respect based on recognition of each other's unique qualities. At club gatherings, observers noted how Barger would often position Bletcher near him, not just as protection, but as a visible symbol of the power at his disposal. In group photos from the era, Bletcher typically stands slightly behind Barger, towering over everyone else, his size making the club president's security clear without a word needing to be said. This visual association benefited both men. For Barger, having the club's most physically imposing member as a clear ally reinforced his leadership. For Bletcher, the close association with Barger gave him a status within the club that his relatively short tenure might not otherwise have earned him. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement that worked on multiple levels. Barger's appreciation for Bletcher went beyond just his fighting ability. According to those familiar with both men, Barger particularly valued Bletcher's self-control. Despite his fearsome reputation and capabilities, Bletcher rarely initiated violence without clear purpose. He wasn't a loose cannon who might create problems for the club through impulsive actions. In an organization where hot-headed behavior could bring unwanted police attention, Bletcher's restraint was as valuable as his strength. This restraint showed itself in how Bletcher handled police interactions as well. While many Hells Angels automatically antagonized law enforcement, Bletcher was known to remain calm during arrests and questioning. He never cooperated, maintaining the club's code of silence, but he also didn't make situations worse through resistance or threats. Barger, always concerned about the club's legal vulnerabilities, appreciated this approach. When Bletcher died in 1975, allegedly shot by his own cousins during a dispute, Barger made sure the Fresno chapter gave him a proper Hells Angels funeral. The event drew members from chapters across California and beyond, a testament to how widely Bletcher's reputation had spread. Barger himself attended, an honor not given to every fallen angel. Years later, when asked about memorable members who had passed through the club's ranks, Barger would occasionally mention Bletcher, usually with a slight shake of his head, as if still amazed by the man's physical capabilities. For someone who had seen thousands of tough men come and go over decades, this lasting impression spoke volumes about Bletcher's impact. Barger's seal of approval helped transform Bletcher from merely a physically imposing member into a Hell's Angels legend. Without this endorsement from the top, Bletcher might have been remembered simply as a big guy who could fight. With it, he became something more, a symbol of the ideal angel in many ways. Loyal, effective, intimidating, and dedicated to the club above all else. Even decades after both men were gone from the scene, Bletcher through death and Barger through retirement and eventually his own passing, old Hell's Angels would still tell stories about the giant who had Sonny's special approval. In a culture where reputation is everything, having the respect of the most respected member created a legacy that outlived the man himself. The legend of Armand Bletcher, already substantial based on his size and fighting ability, was elevated to mythic status largely because the most important figure in Hell's Angels history decided this one was special. Sonny Barger had seen it all, done it all, and known everyone worth knowing in the outlaw biker world. If he said Bletcher was one in a million, who would dare argue? From bullied to bully. The story of Armand Bletcher begins like many tales of men who later become infamous for their toughness, with a skinny kid who was pushed around too many times. Before he became the mountain of muscle that terrorized California's underworld, young Armand was just another target for schoolyard tormentors in 1950s Alameda County. Born in 1942 to Edward Bletcher, a Navy veteran who served in 3 wars, Armand started life with a strong example of masculinity in his home. His father had survived combat in World War II Korea and later Vietnam, a man who understood violence and discipline. But while Edward Bletcher was tough, his son initially was not. The early school photos that still exist show a surprisingly average boy, not particularly small, but certainly nothing like the giant he would become. With dark hair and a serious expression, young Armand blended into class pictures, just another post-war kid in a time when America was booming and suburban life was taking shape. But something was happening to Armand that didn't show in those formal school portraits. According to childhood acquaintances who later spoke about him, Armand was a frequent target for bullies. The exact reasons aren't clear. Perhaps he was quiet or awkward, or simply unlucky enough to catch the attention of the wrong kids. Whatever the cause, the effect was clear: repeated humiliation at the hands of stronger boys. This pattern continued into his early teens. While many kids who suffer bullying find ways to cope, making friends in other circles, excelling at academics, or simply enduring until graduation, Armand apparently chose a different path. Somewhere around age 15, according to those who knew him, he made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He would never be weak again. His transformation began with basic weightlifting. In the 1950s, bodybuilding was nowhere near as common as it is today. Information was limited to a few magazines, and whatever wisdom could be found at local gyms. Equipment was primitive by modern standards, but Armand attacked his new hobby with an intensity that surprised everyone who knew him. While other teenagers were going to dances or playing sports, Armand was lifting weights in his garage. He started with a simple barbell set, adding more plates as his strength increased. His father, recognizing something of himself in his son's determination, supported this interest. After all, physical strength was something a military man could understand and appreciate. Within a year, the changes were noticeable. The formerly average teenager had put on muscle, broadened his shoulders, and grown several inches taller. By 17, he was already standing out in a crowd. But this was just the beginning of his physical transformation. After high school, when many of his classmates went to college or took local jobs, Armand intensified his bodybuilding regimen. Now lifting at a real gym in Oakland, he absorbed knowledge from older bodybuilders and weightlifters. He changed his diet, eating massive amounts of protein. He trained for hours each day, pushing beyond normal limits of endurance. And then, according to persistent rumors that followed him throughout his life, he crossed a line that many serious bodybuilders of that era faced. He began using steroids. In the early 1960s, performance-enhancing drugs were not yet illegal, though they weren't widely available either. The exact substances Armand allegedly used are unclear in the stories. Some accounts mention horse steroids typically used for livestock. Others reference military-grade performance enhancers his father might have helped him obtain. Whatever the truth of these rumors, the results were undeniable. By his early 20s, Armand Bletcher had transformed himself from an ordinary young man into something extraordinary. Standing over 6 feet 8 inches tall and weighing well over 300 pounds, he was now the one who caused fear in others. The psychological transformation matched the physical one. The formerly bullied boy developed a presence that commanded respect, or at least caution, from everyone he encountered. His voice deepened to a rumbling bass. His posture became imposing. He learned to use his size to intimidate without even needing to make threats. This new identity needed a suitable environment, and Arman found it in the emerging outlaw motorcycle culture of 1960s California. The Hells Angels and similar clubs valued exactly what Arman now embodied: physical power, intimidation, and a willingness to use violence. When he began hanging around the Fresno chapter, they immediately recognized his potential. The irony of his situation was probably not lost on Arman. The very qualities that had made him a target as a boy, being different, standing out from the crowd, now made him valuable in his new world. His enormous size, once a source of mockery, had become his greatest asset. As he rose within the Hells Angels hierarchy, Arman developed a reputation for particular cruelty toward those he perceived as bullies. Bar owners who mistreated their staff, men who abused women, or anyone who picked on those weaker than themselves could expect special attention from Bletcher if they crossed his path. This wasn't justice in any formal sense. It was personal, a reflection of his own history. Several accounts describe incidents where Arman intervened when seeing smaller men harassed by groups. One bartender recalled how Bletcher spotted 3 drunk construction workers cornering a much smaller man outside a Fresno bar. Without hesitation, he walked over, physically separated the group, and made it clear that the harassment was over. When one of the construction workers objected, Arman reportedly picked him up by his collar and belt and deposited him in a dumpster. Yet even as he protected some from bullying, Arman had become something of a bully himself. His intimidation tactics weren't limited to defending the innocent. As an enforcer for the Hells Angels, he used his size and strength to collect debts, pressure rivals, and maintain the club's territory. The line between protection and extortion often blurred in the outlaw biker world. By the mid-1970s, when Arman was at the height of his power within the Hells Angels, few would have guessed his origins as a bullied teenager. The massive enforcer seemed like he had always been intimidating, always been powerful. The skinny kid from Alameda County existed only in fading photographs and the memories of those who had known him before. The ultimate tragedy of Arman Bletcher's transformation was that it may have contributed to his death. The overwhelming confidence in his own physical power, the belief that he could intimidate anyone into backing down, likely led him to walk unarmed into his final confrontation with his cousins. For all his size and strength, bullets don't discriminate between the weak and the powerful. In the end, the bullied boy who became a feared enforcer discovered the limits of physical intimidation. All the muscles in the world couldn't stop the 3 bullets that ended his life at age 33. But his legend lives on, a cautionary tale about how trauma can shape a life, how victims sometimes become perpetrators, and how the search for power can lead down dangerous paths. Motorcycle muscle. When most Hells Angels struggled to handle their heavyweight motorcycles, Arman Bletcher made them look like toys. Standing at 6 feet 8 inches and weighing over 350 pounds of solid muscle, his strength wasn't just for show. It was practical in the biker world where heavy machines often needed to be lifted, pushed, or hauled. The story that cemented his reputation for superhuman strength came from none other than Sonny Barger himself. In his memoir, Barger described watching Bletcher single-handedly load 2 Harley-Davidson motorcycles into the back of a pickup truck. For anyone familiar with motorcycles, this feat seems almost impossible. A typical Harley from that era weighed between 600 and 700 pounds. Most men couldn't even push one up a ramp without help, let alone lift it bodily into a truck bed. Bletcher's own motorcycle was customized to accommodate his enormous frame. The handlebars were set wider than standard, the seat was reinforced with extra supports, and the suspension was beefed up to handle his weight. Even with these modifications, he still looked comically large on the bike, his knees sticking out to the sides, his massive boots nearly dragging on the ground at stops. The sight of him on his chopper became legendary among California bikers. People would stare in amazement as he thundered past, the motorcycle seeming to strain under his bulk, yet still roaring along at high speed. Some said the ground shook when Bletcher rode by, an exaggeration surely, but one that captured the impressive image he created. His strength came in handy during the club's frequent relocations. Hells Angels chapters sometimes needed to move their operations quickly, whether to avoid law enforcement attention or to establish presence in new territory. When that happened, motorcycles, parts, tools, and other heavy equipment needed to be transported fast. Bletcher could load a truck in half the time it would take 4 normal men. working tirelessly while others took breaks. Beyond just lifting motorcycles, Bletcher understood them mechanically. His massive hands could apply torque to stubborn bolts that others couldn't budge. He could hold heavy engine blocks in position while others worked on mounting them. He could straighten bent frames and forks after accidents, using pure strength where others would need specialized tools. This combination of size, strength, and practical knowledge made him invaluable to the club beyond his intimidation factor. He wasn't just muscle, he was motorcycle muscle, specially adapted to the needs of an outlaw biker gang. In a world where your machine was your freedom and your identity, having someone who could manhandle those machines was a tremendous asset. When Bletcher died in 1975, one of the most memorable parts of his Hells Angels funeral was the motorcycle procession. His own bike was ridden at the front by another club member, while dozens of angels followed behind. The empty space where his massive frame should have been sitting served as a powerful reminder of just how unique he had been. A giant among men whose strength had become the stuff of biker legend. Bouncer extraordinaire. When Armand Bletcher stood at the door of a bar, trouble stayed outside. During the early 1970s, his reputation as a bouncer spread throughout California's roughest drinking establishments. Bar owners would pay premium rates just to have him work a single weekend night, knowing his presence alone would prevent the costly damages of bar fights and rowdy customers. Standing at the entrance, his massive frame blocking most of the doorway, Bletcher created an immediate impression on anyone trying to enter. His standard pose became legendary, arms crossed over his enormous chest, legs planted shoulder-width apart, head slightly lowered to look down at approaching patrons. He rarely smiled. He didn't need to say much. His body language communicated everything necessary: behave or leave. What made Bletcher different from typical bouncers wasn't just his size, though at 6 feet 8 inches and 350 pounds, he certainly had a physical advantage. It was his approach to the job. While many bouncers enjoyed the power trip and looked for excuses to get physical, Bletcher preferred prevention over confrontation. He could spot potential troublemakers before they even entered the building, noting subtle signs of aggression or excessive intoxication that others might miss. Even claimed their alcohol sales went up because customers felt safer and stayed longer. Bletcher worked at dozens of different establishments throughout Central and Northern California, from dive bars in Fresno to higher-end clubs in San Francisco. His reputation grew to the point that he could name his price, working only when and where he wanted. This freelance approach suited both his independent nature and his other commitments to the Hells Angels. Inside the bars, Bletcher developed a system for handling situations before they escalated. Rather than waiting for a full-blown fight to break out, he would notice when tensions were rising between patrons. A simple walk past the potential combatants, perhaps a casual hand on a shoulder or a meaningful look, was usually enough to diffuse the situation. His message was clear: not in this bar, not tonight. On the rare occasions when someone was foolish enough to start trouble despite his presence, Bletcher's response was swift and effective. He didn't brawl or create additional chaos. Instead, he would isolate the troublemaker, using his massive arms to wrap them up and simply carry them outside. The restraint he showed was notable. Very few people ever reported being injured by Bletcher while he was working security. This professional approach made him valuable beyond just biker bars. Nightclubs, concert venues, and even private parties sought his services. Word spread about the giant bouncer who could control a room without saying a word. The mystique around his Hells Angels membership only added to his effectiveness. People knew he wasn't just a big guy, but a man connected to a world where violence was taken seriously. Fellow bouncers who worked with Bletcher often described the experience as the easiest shift of their lives. With him handling the front door, their job became mostly ceremonial. Some bars even reduced their security staff on nights when Bletcher was scheduled, knowing one of him was worth 3 or 4 average men. Perhaps the ultimate testament to his skills came from law enforcement. Several police officers from that era later admitted they were relieved when they heard Bletcher was working at potentially problematic establishments. They knew calls from those locations would be fewer on those nights, and any situations that did arise would likely be contained before police arrival became necessary. When Armand Bletcher died in 1975, several bar owners in Fresno and surrounding towns closed for the evening as a sign of respect. For them, he hadn't just been muscle for hire. He had been a professional who made their businesses safer and more profitable through his unique presence and approach to security. Never lost a fight. In the rough-and-tumble world of 1970s biker culture, fighting wasn't just common, it was practically a job requirement. Most Hells Angels members had their share of victories and defeats. But according to biker law, Armand Bletcher stood apart with an undefeated record that became the stuff of legend. From barroom brawls to organized club fights, the Giant Angel reportedly never walked away on the losing end. This perfect record wasn't just luck or even his obvious size advantage. Bletcher approached fighting with the same methodical mindset he brought to everything else. While many bikers fought with wild, uncontrolled aggression, Bletcher remained calm and calculated even in the most chaotic situations. He sized up opponents quickly, identified weaknesses, and used only the force necessary to end the confrontation. His fighting style wasn't flashy. He didn't know formal martial arts or boxing techniques. What he had instead was an intuitive understanding of how to use his massive size effectively. His reach advantage meant he could hit opponents before they got close enough to strike him. His weight meant that even a glancing blow from his fist carried tremendous force, and his height allowed him to look down on most opponents, an immediate psychological advantage. One of his most effective tactics was surprisingly simple: the bear hug. When an opponent got too close, Bletcher would wrap his enormous arms around them, squeezing just enough to restrict breathing and movement without causing serious injury. Many fights ended right there, with his opponent unable to continue. Those who managed to break free usually found themselves too exhausted to put up much further resistance. Witnesses to Bletcher's fights often described the same pattern. The confrontation would begin, typically with his opponent showing bravado and aggression. Bletcher would stand calmly, hands at his sides, watching. When the opponent finally moved in, Bletcher's response was direct and overwhelming. One or two massive blows that ended things before they really began. It wasn't exciting or dramatic, it was efficient. Physical advantages aside, what truly set Bletcher apart was his pain tolerance. Where other fighters might be slowed down or distracted by injuries, he seemed almost immune to pain during combat. He would absorb punches, bottle strikes, even knife wounds in some accounts, and continue fighting with undiminished effectiveness. This wasn't just toughness. Witnesses described it as something almost supernatural, as if pain signals simply didn't reach his brain during fights. By the time of his death in 1975, Bletcher's undefeated record had become an important part of Hell's Angels mythology. Whether he truly never lost a fight is impossible to verify now, but the consistency of the stories from multiple sources suggests that if he ever did taste defeat, it was rare enough to be forgotten in favor of the legend of the unbeatable giant. Tragic end. For a man who seemed almost invincible in fights, Armand Bletcher met his end in a surprisingly ordinary way. On November 25, 1975, the giant Hell's Angel was shot and killed by his own cousins, the Pasayan brothers, at their tire shop in Fresno, California. He was just 33 years old. The circumstances leading to his death read like something from a crime drama. According to reports, Bletcher was under investigation by the FBI for various illegal activities connected to his Hell's Angels membership. Looking for a way to explain his income to authorities, he approached his cousins about putting him on their tire shop's payroll as a cover. When they refused to get involved in his scheme, tension built between the relatives. On that fateful November day, Bletcher reportedly went to confront his cousins about their refusal. Despite his fearsome reputation and history of violence, he made a critical mistake. He went to the meeting unarmed. Perhaps he believed his size and intimidation factor would be enough, as it had been countless times before. The confrontation quickly escalated. The Pasayan brothers, fearing for their lives, allegedly struck Bletcher with a baseball bat. In a testament to his legendary toughness, even this didn't stop the giant angel. As he continued to advance, one brother fired warning shots at the ground. When these failed to deter Bletcher, Josh Pasayan fired 3 bullets directly at him. The shots hit Bletcher in the back and he fell. For a man who had shrugged off countless punches, broken bottles, and even knife wounds, it was plain lead bullets that finally proved his mortality. The brothers claimed self-defense against an unarmed but incredibly dangerous man, and no murder charges were filed. The Hell's Angels gave Bletcher a proper biker funeral, with a long procession of motorcycles escorting his casket. Sonny Barger himself reportedly attended, a mark of respect for the fallen giant. In death, as in life, Bletcher stood out. His custom-made coffin was one of the largest ever ordered in Fresno County. The timing of Bletcher's death added another layer of tragedy to his story. Just when federal authorities were closing in on him, perhaps threatening his freedom, his life was cut short not by law enforcement but by family members. Some speculated that had he lived, he might have faced serious criminal charges related to the ongoing FBI investigation. Others suggested he was preparing to leave California altogether, possibly to start fresh in another Hell's Angels chapter far from federal scrutiny. His death sent shockwaves through the outlaw biker community. For years, members had believed Bletcher was untouchable, a giant who could handle any physical threat. The fact that he could be killed by ordinary men with ordinary guns was a sobering reminder of mortality for everyone in the club.